Okay, well, good evening and welcome. I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. Slightly different tack to our usual topic. Professor Maeve Long is the Eamon Cleary Chair of Irish Studies at the University of Otago. And she has many strings to her bow in terms of research topics and research interests. But the particular one she's going to talk tonight about is traveling with immunity, marketing the immune system across the British Empire, 1890 to 1940. So please welcome our speaker for tonight, Maeve.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much, Terence, for inviting me to speak, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm going to begin with a provocative, bold opening. Modernity is a time of immunity. The modern self is an immune self. But in this short statement, I don't mean to imply that such an immune state can be realized, nor that it is a good thing, nor that such immunity is homogeneous. But what I do mean is that around the dawn of immunology as a discipline, which we can date to around 1880, a wealth of metaphors around the idea of medical immunity, of discourses that extend this notion of protection and isolation to the political arena sprang up. And within this discourse was a strong emphasis and commitment across a range of fields to discourses of the possibility of an immune self. So personally, I became interested in the idea of immunity because of my work in literary theory and political theory. And towards the end of the 20th century, quite a lot of political and literary and critical theorists started becoming quite fascinated with the idea of immunity as a metaphor for society. Donna Haraway, for example, talks about immunity as a kind of a defining metaphor for late capitalism. Jacques Derrida, who you might have heard of, he talks about the autoimmune nature of politics, by which he means that one can democratically elect an anti-democratic leader. And so to his mind, this is the kind of the innate autoimmune problem or core of politics. A philosopher called Peter Sloterdijk says that we're living in a period of the immunological self, what he calls kind of homo immunological. So the immune self is, for Sloterdijk, an individual whose defining feature is protection and isolation. And an Italian philosopher called Roberto Esposito has said that modernity really can be best understood as a negotiation between immunity and community, between the tendency towards a collective, towards a sharing, and the tendency towards isolation, individualism, and being cut off. And as many nations move towards increasing interest in nationalism, Esposito sees this as a drive against globalism that he maps onto an immunization or an immunity understanding of the self. So then, don't worry, this is not a theory paper. This is going to be history in a minute. Modernity, then, is a time of immunity. But because these theorists are usually interested in the kind of the political foundations of the contemporary, they tend to concentrate on the 20th and the 21st centuries. The earliest back they go is really to the Second World War. And so my interest has been, well, what can we understand, not so much about the kind of the great history of institutions, nor so much the history of great individuals, great scientists who've made discoveries about immune systems, but what can we understand about how the public might have conceptualized this thing we call the immune system around the dawn of immunology as a discipline? And so I've been interested then in thinking about what ways narratives of immunity were disseminated to the public and what they represented. And so this is where my Marsden project comes in. So I gathered together a team of researchers, and we analyzed every newspaper ad that mentioned immunity or immune and its cognates in the British newspaper archives, the Irish newspaper archives, the New Zealand newspaper archives, which you'll know as Papers Past, and the Australian archive called Trove. From 1890, so just a decade or so after the start of immunology as a discipline, to 1940. So around the period of antibiotics, the changes brought about by the war, and a kind of a general shift in understanding. That's not to say that once immunity as a discourse entered public consciousness, or in my instance, entered marketing discourses, that it ever really left. As you probably know yourselves from picking up a lot of newspapers or magazines, the idea of selling immunity or selling ideas of how to biohack your health is pretty constant. So once discourses got interested in the idea of immunity as a sales pitch, as a marketing tool, as a kind of an understanding of different ideas of health, it never really left. But we can map a little bit of an ebb and flow. So it really peaks in the 1920s and then kind of stabilizes. So what I was interested in doing with my team is tracking the movement of this idea of immunity across the British Empire, looking at Britain, Ireland, which at that time was both part of Britain and then independent, Australia and New Zealand, seeing what ideas changed, what remained, and what we can understand from this concept. Now, even though I'm using advertising and talking about what we can glean from these ads, I'm not suggesting that people read the ads in a naive way. Everything we know about the way in which marketing material was engaged with from the 19th century on suggests that people read as kind of both conscientiously and carefully and strategically and with grave doubt as we would today. Nonetheless, advertising is useful as a measure of public awareness of ideas because ads are so ubiquitous, because people read them in newspapers again and again and again, even if they never stop and give them kind of the absolute attention you might to a newspaper article. So we're interested in this kind of slow but continuous messaging about a topic that you get from advertising, supplemented, of course, by the fact that during this period, there were hundreds of thousands of articles about what immunity might be, educating the public, questioning it, associating it with different groups. So the information that I'm going to present to you today comes from the team collecting, collating, breaking down, and analyzing those hundreds of thousands of ads into groups and seeing what major themes we can track across the period. All right. So, to give us a starting point, on the 31st of August, 1899, an ad for the Century Dictionary gave a list of 30 words that puzzle the general reader. Included in these words, which the, quote, average man will hardly find it easy to define, were things like antitoxin, aerobic, and immune. And yet, a decade later, the words immune and immunity were regularly used to market a wide range of products in Britain, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. What can we gain then from this pathway, this movement, from the confusing term of immunity to this sense of flu germs being active, no one is immune, to immunity being promised as the highway to good health? So, idea one, preventative medicine, or rather defense rather than healing. There are some fundamental recurring ideas of immunity. Eli Metchnikoff's recognition of immunity as a defensive process meant that defense quite quickly replaced healing as medicine's scientifically approved ethos. And so across these ads, immunity is associated kind of as its baseline metaphor or its baseline iconography with shields and physical barricades. And those shields and physical barricades replicate over and over and over again until we get the idea that kind of everything is immune, or everything has the potential to be immune. So there's no noticeable class or gender bias in the ads and their discourse of shielding or isolation. A narrative of immunity is not specifically associated with high-end, nor specifically with affordable products, nor with products specifically associating themselves as modern or traditional. And I had thought when I started this project that maybe immunity would be the kind of narrative that products that wanted to sell themselves as innovative and technologically advanced would adopt. But it was widespread across different types of products. While more products involving children tend to be marketed towards women, there was no specific gender bias around the idea of immunity. It was neither highly feminized nor highly masculinized. There's a slightly different idea once we bring race into the mix, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So obviously, large numbers of patent medicines promised their consumers that they could achieve immunity to a large number of ailments by using their products. But patent medicine ads were joined by products that presented themselves as kind of medically adjacent or part of a healthy lifestyle. So raincoats, woolen underwear, shoes, cosmetics, and food all promised that you could buy or become immune through their products. In all the four sites, the importance of agriculture meant that a large number of ads for immune variety of potatoes, and I'm Irish and I do love a good potato, but there were thousands of potato ads, which got a bit fatiguing. And then in Australia, a lot of ads that were interested in cattle and immunity. Cars and bicycles were presented as aiding immunity by protection or exercise, or were presented as themselves immune to various hazards. So as such, immunity is a discourse of protection extended from the human to the non-human, including animals and mechanical objects, but also houses and geographical areas. Now, this extension is self-interested in the sense that the immunity offered to the non-human serves to reinforce a narrative of the protection of the self, as not only are individuals able to be immune in body, they can also buy objects that are themselves immune to breakdown. There were whole swathes of ads that promised that your stockings were immune to ladders, that your coats were immune to tears. And so bit by bit, by putting on these clothes that gave you immunity but were themselves immune, you kind of built up this layering process of immunity, kind of deeply protected from the skin out. The specific versus the pervasive. So although technically the story of immunity is linked to stories of greater specificity, of immune recognition of and response to various specific bacteria, and then later on viruses. And although the public would have encountered this specificity through vaccination programs, in popular discourse, immunity tended towards the general, towards being immune to every germ, every threat, regardless. So immunity is often presented as complete or absolute. And one way I've been thinking about this with my kind of literary studies hat on is in terms of what's called a metonym or a synecdoche. If those terms aren't familiar to you, a metonym and a synecdoche usually refer to something we allude to by mentioning part of it or an attribute of it. For example, if you've ever talked about the monarchy but said the word the crown, that's a metonym. If you've ever talked about the ocean and said the blue or the deep, those are synecdoches, those are attributes. So we talk about a larger thing by taking small bits of it. And so the functioning of immunity in these ads is in terms of the metonym or the synecdoche. So these ads tend to promise immunity to one thing, or sometimes a general grouping of things, but the build-up, the image presented is of an absolute whole. Be immune to this cough, be immune in general, be immune to, I don't know, nervousness, live through immunity. Immunity from winter ills builds up to the idea of immunity to anything that life can throw at you. There's a series of ads that come from New Zealand, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute, for a product called Wood's Great Peppermint Cure, which you may or may not have heard of. Yeah, and a lot of these ads were in poetic form, and I use poetry slightly loosely because, bless them, they are really terrible. They're what we'd often refer to as doggerel. But this is a nice one. Blow, blow, thou wintry wind, blow all you know. Rail, hail, or snow, you may be most unkind. Really, I do not mind, for I'm immune, secure. I take Wood's Great Peppermint Cure, leaving ill health behind. All right, scans horribly. But you see this idea of just, I am immune. And it's building up a picture. Sure, we can intuit what it's saying you're immune to. But what it's saying is, can be immune in general. I am immune. I am secure. I have utter, complete protection. All right, we can extend this to thinking about immunity as part of modern discourses of labor. So preventative medicine, as you all know, has been a hugely important step in improving population health. But it's also an approach that really quite adroitly lends itself to a capitalist approach to health. That is, while preventative medicine has enabled people to live longer and be healthier, there's also a longer period of health during which they are actively engaged in not becoming sick. And that means, from a marketing perspective, that the pool of people that you can sell products to, people who are anxious about becoming sick, is quite large. So a lot of work in this area is really interested in the way in which there's this kind of a symmetry between a burgeoning capitalism among products and this notion of preventative medicine. So in the ads, immunity is often presented in terms of a habit or a task that the public should work at in order to achieve. With work in this context, usually meaning purchasing a particular product or picking up a particular habit. And so that idea of kind of the Krishkin habit in this context or the Rexona habit in this comes up again and again. And often those who are really interested in theorizing modernity talk about it as a period of self-reflexive awareness of certain kinds of tasks, where you're actively involved in the labor of being modern, or you're actively involved in working through various attributes of modernity, one of which being capitalism. So this sense of getting immunity through a habit is a real definite sense of immunity as embedded in these modern capitalist discourses. Immunity before the immune system. So while at this period, immunity is tied up in discourses of active pursuit, of building habits, of laboring at being immune through purchasing, immunity in these ads is usually not presented as a system, and it's very rarely presented as a process. It's usually presented instead as a prize or an outcome, something you get. It's something that you labor for and something you can achieve through strategic purchasing. Now, that's not to say that there's no evidence of any kind of systemic or systematic thinking in these ads. So, in 1899, an ad for Bovril in British newspapers warned about the enemy at home. And it says, it's a bit hard to see there, influenza is again in our midst, and timely precautions are of the utmost importance. By toning up the system and imparting to it a healthy glow of natural warmth, Bovril prevents and counteracts the dangerous effects of cold and thus ensures immunity from the epidemic. And this, of course, mixes ideas of medicine and war pretty nicely. Now, the Bovril ad ran in Ireland. A similar ad ran for Scott's Emulsion in New Zealand. And a little earlier in Australia, we have an ad called for Radam's Microbe Killer, which is a nice direct sense of market advertising in Australia. This text-heavy form of advertising was really common. It takes a while before advertising starts playing with space and images as we would see it now. But in this, they also use an expression around systems. I'll read it out. To feel that the system does not, through its veins and arteries, suck up the poison which is sure to undermine and destroy is indeed a blessing, beyond all other human enjoyments. To purchase immunity from such a fate should be the object of all afflicted. So as such, in these early decades, it's not that an immune system gives us health, but that the body's system, when made healthy, attains immunity. So the ads talk about the body's system. They talk about digestive systems. They use phrases like nervous systems. But immunity is the end game of having this perfect shield, rather than the networks and communications and responses that create the shield. So the phrase immune system isn't mentioned once in these ads. And this aligns with David Napier's sense that the idea of an immune system dates from the 1960s. Now, from then on, from the 1960s on, imagery must contend with immunity as a kind of a complex system. And we tend to talk more these days, I think, about immune systems rather than immunity. But pre-World War II, it was all about a state of being, like an ontology, so an attainable endgame. So then, while immunity is bound up in modern discourses of labor, the task isn't focused on the mechanics of immunity, but improving the body so that it becomes immune. And in this way, immunity is part of the rise of self-help that we associate with the late 19th and early 20th century. And the language that we see associated with it are things like strong and healthy, robust, better. Which brings us to what health means when the idea of immunity is introduced. So immunity, then, is the impossibility of illness. The introduction of a discourse of immunity offers a new understanding, or at the very least, of articulating health. So a discourse of immunity means that health is not simply the state of not being ill, but a state whereby illness is impossible. And in these ads, health and immunity are usually presented as quite different states. In 1905, in newspapers in Australia and New Zealand, ads for Dr. McLaughlin's electric belt ran. And I won't show you this because it's one of the 1905 really text-heavy ones. But in that, they claim the principle of long life, immunity from disease, and perfect health rests with the amount of natural electricity contained in your body. In some instances, ads argued that perfect health enabled immunity. And we see this claim in products like Hall's wine that ran between 1906 and 1909 in the UK. But an example from Ireland, from Irish newspapers, is for Wincarnis. And Wincarnis is one of a series of tonics, often that were about 20% alcohol. So if they didn't cure your cold, they definitely made you feel a lot better. There's actually, I mean, I'm sure you know, there's a whole really interesting history of anxiety about what they called secret drinkers. And because it wasn't very socially acceptable for women to go to the pub, they could, however, go and buy tonic wines to kind of make themselves feel better. So the idea of women being able to access alcohol and becoming alcoholics through drinking really strong fortified wines was a real panic around the period. Anyway, Wincarnis tonics we're also selling this idea of a slight difference between immunity and health. So down at the bottom, you can more or less see Wincarnis tonic wine told readers to take Wincarnis now and build up the immunity that glorious health gives. Build up the immunity that health will give you. Similarly, also in Ireland, Green's cod liver oil told readers that they could be healthy, vigorous, and immune from many illnesses prevalent, as well as finding the secret to glowing health in winter and remarkable immunity from pretty much everything. So in becoming immune and entering, so to speak, an all-encompassing, kind of sublime state of total exception, the consumer attains an additional vital category of complex wellness. So within the language of advertising, immunity is health protected, health that is ironclad, health that is invisible to germs and impervious to threat. So these ads don't simply promise health, which is what the consumers had before they got sick, but a state of complete protection from becoming sick again, with the proviso, of course, that sometimes this complete protection requires habitual purchasing. But nonetheless, there is this sense that these ads are giving you a new form of health, kind of what I might call health plus, so health plus immunity, a new modern way to be well, but also a new modern task to be undertaken. So a discourse of borders is not a discourse of sharing. There's been theoretical work done on the connections between immunity and community, as I mentioned at the start. And today, particularly in this post-COVID period, or at least this period in which COVID is ongoing, the idea of herd immunity has quite a lot of purchase. Now, the concept of herd immunity had become a core part of epidemiology by the 1930s. And if, for example, we look at Australia, there's numerous articles in Australian newspapers around the idea of herd immunity. The first mention I could find was in 1917 in relation to livestock. And by 1930, there were conversations taking place around human herd immunity, so human infectious diseases. But the term herd immunity is never used in advertising. I could not find a single mention of the phrase in any of the ads we looked at in any country. And even if you ignore the specificity of the phrase, so forget about the particular term herd immunity, even if you look for the kind of the idea of herd immunity or an idea of shared immunity, and instead we look to the subject of the discourse of the ads, we see that the vast majority of the ads in all of the countries tend to concentrate on the individual. So there's a lot of sense of defend you, protect you, you will gain this. If we look a little bit beyond the individual, the next group tends to be the family, usually children first, and then the family as a unit. There are a few exceptions in that often the individual or the family can be part of a group referred to as thousands of people, in the sense of thousands of people have purchased blah, 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 and are now better. But those thousands of people are rarely forming a community. Instead, really, we have a discourse of immunity that is always about the individual, not a collectivity. This is one of the ads I like. That's from Irish newspapers as well. To keep yourself immune from chills, from colds, and all your other ills, have shredded wheat for breakfast. This is also a great period of real interest in the idea of food and immunity, and kind of a discourse of the healthy self through the healthy gut. So there's not a discourse of protection that is enhanced by being shared or spread across a community, and not really a discourse of sharing at all. Instead, the emphasis is on protection, on the creation of borders for the self. Immunity, then, in this period, is pretty selfish. This one actually is a nice example. This is an example from a small mention of the family, But even then, the family is presented in terms of kind of just the severing of the group. The feet represent kind of the individuals. So, immunity to what? A discourse of immunity is useful if we're trying to think in terms of changing etiologies. So mapping a cause of disease is difficult in these ads because they're for a range of products promising to treat a range of illnesses, even if the end goal is always this kind of generalized sense of immunity. But what stands out enables us to think through this tension between immunity and community, between the self and the grouping, or the self and the collective in more detail. So across the product types, across the countries, and across the decades, germs and microbes are usually presented as the main threat to health. More so than crowds, more so than crowded places like buses and trains, and more so across the ads in the countries than the weather, though New Zealand is a little bit of an exception to this, and we'll come back to it. But as such, at a macro level, immunity tends to be promised not against people with germs, but against the germs themselves, which are usually presented either as kind of just omnipresent, so germs are just either always there, or germs are kind of seasonal, as if the germs themselves, kind of like swallows, come and go or hibernate at certain points. Now, you can explain this concentration on a discourse of germs in a few ways. The general power of germ theory as an explanatory cause of disease. Its affective power in representing omnipresent risk. And there's definitely lots of ads that are similar to this one that says, imagine how awful you'd feel, how terrified you'd permanently be if we could actually see the disease germs that are constantly surrounding you. There's a lot of senses of people trying to grapple with this new worldview where suddenly things that seemed empty are full of things, full of germs. So if you're selling a product, of course, that is trying to mitigate risk, a narrative that says risk is everywhere, disease is everywhere, is quite a useful tool in your arsenal. It's also possible that this emphasis on the germ, on germ theory, is kind of an escalation or an improvement of the product. It gives it this kind of lure of the scientific and the technical. And perhaps we can say that by locating the cause of disease to non-human sources, it stops you from blaming certain groups of people. And even though marketing really has no vested interest in absolute equality in these instances, you also don't want to lose potential markets. So given that the germs aren't going to purchase anything, if you make the germs the cause of disease, you're in no danger of losing purchasers. But those reasons that I've given you map out why copywriters might express immunity in this way. So let's think a little bit beyond that. And let's think of it in terms of, well, if immunity is presented as something an individual needs to have, something protective, boundary reinforcing, that makes the individual strong and robust, then we can potentially argue that this selfish discourse that I've told you about, that this emphasis on the individual is such that it can't even cognize the idea of other people as a form of threat. The individual instead doesn't move through a collectivity, but rather moves through a world in which the main cause of concern is non-human. So it really then creates a sense of the battle or the war taking place being between the self and the non-human, the other in that sense, rather than between human and human. So immunity is a selfish discourse. And while people might lurk in the background, they're usually kind of hidden behind, as we can see with these arrows, the primary cause of threat, omnipresent germs. And since germs are everywhere then, risk is everywhere. By necessity, the discourse of immunity has to be one of impossible, extensive, non-specific protection. Now, to my mind, the best example of an escalating narrative of risk that we found in the ads were in Burberry ads. Now, these ads ran for about 30 years in British newspapers and magazines. Interestingly, I couldn't find any of these, and by which I mean the ads that specifically sold Burberry coats and dresses through a narrative of immunity in Australia and New Zealand ads. And that might just be because of the kind of the vagaries of digitizing processes, or there could be something else there that the team can look at later. But basically, what we see is that in the early Burberry ads, protection tends to be promised from specific types of weather. Wear this trench coat, you will be protected from the rain. Wear this coat, you'll be protected from the cold. And then as the ads progress, the language shifts from specificity to something a little bit more general. And it talks about, don't protect yourself just from the rain. Protect yourself from the very fact that weather is unpredictable. Protect yourself from changeable weather. So we've moved from a specific thing to the very idea of the world being unchangeable, or sorry, the world being changeable, the world being unpredictable. So they're promising, in a sense, a way of clothing yourself, of being clad against that which you cannot anticipate. As you can imagine, as the ads moved into the First World War, and there is a really interesting correlation then between discourses of immunity and discourses of protection within the war and the trenches, we see this sense of narratives of exposure and risk really escalating, but kind of in a doubling way. In other words, this sense of protecting yourself against the changeable, against the unpredictable, which was usually associated with recreational pursuits like hunting, is now moved into the field of war. Protect yourself against the really unpredictable things that happen during trench warfare. So trench warfare then becomes likened to hunting, kind of decreasing of anxieties, and hunting becomes likened to trench warfare, an escalation of the importance and nobility of recreational pursuits, all through this discourse of immunity against everything that life can throw at you. Right, we're moving to the last section, which is a slightly longer one. How am I doing for time? Cool. So, final one, power loves immunity. So we all know that discourses of immunity have been connected with ideas of race. So in all of the countries that we looked at, there were articles, not ads, but articles expressing fascination, often in a quite exoticizing way, with the idea that different communities had different levels of immunity to snakebite or different diseases. And often these discourses are presented in slightly Orientalist, what we consider today slightly problematic ways. But in the ads, racial identity and racial difference aren't too directly engaged with, but there are some interesting exceptions. Here's a series of ads that ran in the 30s in Australia for the Good Health Club. Now, the idea of the Good Health Club of Australia was basically that modern diets are making people sick, that people are eating what we'd now, I suppose, called ultra-high processed foods. And so the idea was that people should start eating more indigenous types of diets. But even though this is a narrative that says indigenous diets are positive, the types of descriptions of indigenous diets and the representations of indigenous peoples tended to be exoticized, also tended to be quite reductive, but also particularly, given it's an Australian context, also tended to be indigenous people not from Australia. So there was this sense of, as long as we take groups not from here, take a little bit of knowledge from the way they eat, get a little bit of understanding of how they conduct themselves, we can basically then kind of immunize ourselves against our own modernity, with the understanding, of course, that modernity is by and large superior. So it kind of becomes a narrative of immunization. Protect yourself against the other by taking a little bit from the other and bolstering the system through it. In New Zealand, the ads barely make any mention of an indigenous population at all. There's obviously some local names in Te Reo. There's a product called Taniwha soap. But on the whole, the discourse of the ads is very much focused on a settler population and a settler experience. But I wonder if some of the discourse of discomfort around the weather is kind of filtering through or processing a slight anxiety about relationships with the land. So here's another one from Wood's Great Peppermint Cure. Colds come our way in the month of May and coughs in the month of June. In grim July, however we try, to catarrh we're never immune. On the August stage, when dust storms rage, there are all kinds of colds to endure. Likewise in September, so wisely remember your Wood's Great Peppermint Cure. That one is a slightly better poem, but yeah. So I think that the anxiety that we see across the Wood's Great Peppermint Cure ads and across a number of New Zealand products that are also trying to heal or cure coughs and colds and kind of ubiquitous forms of maladies, there is this underlying tension between germs, as I said, being the major cause of disease, and kind of the land making people sick. So this sense of bolstering yourself from the weather, from the situation, from the environment. And so we began, the team who worked on this with me, to suspect that a discourse of protection, a discourse of immunity, appears to dominate when the authorship or the expected readership lies with those who are in power. And that immunity tends to be most useful and resonate most strongly with those who are in power and worried about losing it. And this is particularly clear in the Irish context. Now, this is a very turbulent period in Irish history. And I expected when I started this project to find a narrative of immunity taken up in a lot of Irish ads, in Catholic newspapers, in Republican-focused newspapers. And that's pretty much exactly the opposite of what I found. So when you compare the Irish Times and the Irish Independent, there is a noticeable bias within the Irish Times, which is an Anglo-Irish Protestant newspaper during this period, when compared to the Irish Independent, which is a Catholic newspaper. The Irish Times had far more ads interested in a narrative of immunity and selling a narrative of immunity, even though the Irish Independent had far more advertising pages and a far bigger readership. And we see that again when we look at newspapers that are Protestant focused from the north of Ireland. And so by putting all this together, I began to think that if you have a discourse of shielding, if you have a discourse of protection, that really what you're talking about is a discourse of kind of not losing power. So a metaphor of protection is not particularly useful to a body or a body politic that's already infected. If a colonizing force is already there, has long infiltrated and overcome defenses. If the desire is to recover rather than avoid contamination, then immunity is perhaps not the best concept or not the best metaphor for this. So immunity then, this work suggests, is a metaphor more likely to appeal to a dominant group who feel that their borders, their positions, their security, their dominance, and even their coherence within a place to be under attack. They're a group feeling in need of a defensive shield rather than a group wishing to smash the systems that are in place. So immunity then is a kind of a conservative metaphor about conserving health, about knowing borders, about ensuring those borders are not overcome. So for a ruling class worried about incursion, not a revolutionary class wanting to overthrow. So that brings us to the end of our considerations of immunity. So by mapping its movement across these 4 different sites, across the decades from 1890 to 1940, by bringing it all together and mapping it out thematically, I've presented 10 points that give us some insights into the way in which immunity was presented to the public, and the way in which a discourse of immunity might have been understood by readers, purchasers, consumers during this period. Thank you.
Thank you, Maeve. I've got a question. Considering all the medicines that you mentioned, some were familiar to me. Boddington's Irish Moss. As a child, I had it. It was lovely. And so I wondered if the medicines you're talking about were for just to make people feel better because they tasted nice, like Boddington's Irish Moss, which is just lovely. Or were some of the earlier medicines you talked about, I'd never heard of, Wincarnis was one of them.
It's a tonic, yeah, tonic wine.
Yeah. Were they of a chemical composition, so meant to produce some effect rather than just make you feel good, taste nice? I mean, was there some magical chemical or chemical approach that would...
In other words, did they work?
Well, yes.
So there's been a lot of work being done on patent medicines. And even at the time, there was a lot of anxiety about patent medicine and whether or not it was promising more than it could actually deliver, or whether or not it was actually doing active harm. And so both in Australia, New Zealand, and in Britain, there were kind of government inquiries launched in and quite long reports written. And you can still download it. It's really quite interesting. A lot of groups of scientists got together, purchased patent medicines, and then went and analyzed them and then released their findings. And it really depends. So in some instances, the best you could hope for was that it would do no harm. So some just had kind of basically no active ingredients. Some people who work on in the area have said, actually, kind of we're aligned with what would have been considered best practice at the time. So even though there was a lot of concern in these debates about the alcohol content of the tonic wines in particular, this is still a period where doctors were prescribing alcohol when people were trying to get over influenza. And so there's not that much difference then between the kind of the patent medicine solution and the doctor's solution. And then some actively had ingredients that were quite harmful. So I think with the tonic wines example, I think that they were probably just making people a little bit drunk and feel better. But some had things like quinine in them, and some had kind of various salts that would have helped with stomach aches.
Yes. So there was no real attempt at a scientific treatment in these medicines. It was to make the person feel better rather than an early immune experiment.
Oh, I see what you mean. In terms of the...
Well, you're using the term immunity.
Because they are, yes.
So they were.
Yeah.
So did they imagine that they were doing something chemical to stimulate the immune system rather than make people feel good?
Yeah, it's hard to give you a single answer to that, you see, because we're talking about thousands of different kinds of products. And particularly as you go into the 30s, a lot of the products were made by pharmaceutical companies that we would still recognize today, particularly in Australia. So they would have thought in terms of creating a chemical product that would have had a particular effect on the body. But other ones were just basically sucky sweets that made you feel nice. Yeah, it's just, it's a swathe of responses.
Yeah. Any other question?
Can't have only one question. Sorry. Lovely history. Can I ask you about the present?
Yes.
Personal. Do you take any? Do you take vitamins and supplements? My wife and I rattle in the mornings with the supplements we take. Are we wasting our time? What do you think? Do you take any?
So this is beyond the period that I work in, and I should say, as Terence said, I'm not a medical doctor. My background, but nonetheless, I'm one of the people who've been, I don't know, suckered in, convinced by kombuchas. So I do make a lot of kombucha at home. So this kind of the connection between digestive systems and immunity is something that I am, for a layperson, slightly convinced by. Who knows whether or not that is actually having any effect, but it seemed to work for me. And I mean, that stems back to Metchnikoff. Metchnikoff actually wrote quite a lot on the connections between the digestive system and immunity, and was really quite convinced that yogurt would save us all. Yeah, exactly.
Until about early 1970s, in Britain, there were two classes of medicines. One class would be the kind you just showed us.
Like the patent
And there was
medicines.
another class described as ethical medicines. Now, for the period that you've referred to, medicines were controlled either under the poisons legislation or under the sale of goods legislation. And there wasn't, leaving aside those two things, there wasn't any other control. And, given the germ theory, like around about the same time as newspaper reading became established habit in Britain. So the first advertisement in a newspaper in Britain was actually 1868, Beecham's Pills.
Yeah.
Slightly before the germ theory. But some of the products you described here, just the act of sucking something not only relieves the throat, but it will also reduce the microbial count in the mouth. And the Vincarnis is excellent stuff. It's got about 5% alcohol.
I think it's more. I think it's about 20 according to those early forms. I mean, it might have reduced now, but in the early 20th century.
In your research, did you take into account that there were two categories of remedies? There was one remedy which was advertised to the public, but there was alongside that, there were, comparable products which were not. A very common example, even recent example, that in Britain, soluble aspirin marketed as Disprin was advertised as another product.
Yeah.
Same manufacturer, same product, exactly the same formula as Solprin was not advertised.
Yeah.
Just anyway, these are.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating history. So there's been a lot of work that basically argues that the history of patent medicine is the history of advertising, that there would be no history of advertising without patent medicine, because all of the innovations in advertising come from patent medicine advertisers. So all that sense of using space differently, using headlines and taglines in an innovative way, all were innovated by patent medicine advertisers.
Goods Act.
Pardon?
Or Sale of Goods Act.
Yeah.
The products were, articles sold subject to the Sale of Goods Act, the doctrine of caveat emptor applied, meaning let the buyer beware. But the other category of medicines didn't, and there were some very reputable products. Allen and Hanbury's was a very good.
Yeah, you see there.
Very good, like ethical manufacturer.
Yeah.
So thank you. Others might wish.
So during this period, there is increasing regulation. So this is the period where we move from ads at the very kind of the late 19th century that basically say that the list of things that they can cure are just, as long as your arm, like huge paragraphs of we'll promise cures to everything. And bit by bit, the regulations did work. More and more countries clamped down on what could be promised, but there was still a lot of loopholes. And what is interesting to me is that the promise of immunity never seemed to be one that could be regulated, because it was this it was too fluid, too open, too unclear. It was everything and nothing simultaneously. So everybody is kind of fixated and fascinated with this idea of having what we would now call an immune system. But nobody seemed to regulate anybody promising that you could purchase immunity, because no one was quite clear what it was. And so in terms of the kind of the restriction of the control by Poisons Act or Sale of Goods Act, if you read the legislation in New Zealand around, I think it's around 1910-ish, if somebody can remember, but it really says it's controlling patent medicine. It's actually controlling the advertising. So the people who get in trouble actually are the advertisers and the newspapers, and they're the ones who face really heavy fines. And so there's still this sense that kind of controlling proprietary medicine, so medicine that is copyrighted or patented, is quite difficult, but controlling the language through which it's sold is potentially more accessible, but still not very well applied.
Got a question from Catherine Hall.
Oh, thank you very much, May, for a really fascinating talk. And it's amazing how humanities and historical approach can give us extra insights into something that's really sort of quite familiar. It's given me a lot of food for thought. I wanted to just go back to about halfway through the talk, you were discussing about how the focus was on individual purchase of these products. And that made me think about how there's always this tension in a community between health as an individual's responsibility and health as a community responsibility, and the sort of factors that explain how this lands differently for different societies. So I was wondering if you would mind commenting on what you feel is the driven imperatives of capitalism underlying this drive towards getting individuals to purchase. I mean, did groups go out and purchase en masse immune products to distribute to maybe less wealthy would-be patrons who would not otherwise afford it? Or was it because of this capitalist imperative that it was focused on individuals? And my other question, which I don't know whether you're able to answer, but I'm rather intrigued, is how did this discourse compare to the discourse of immunity in socialist or communist countries during the 20th century?
Yeah, that would be fascinating to know. So I can answer the second part first, because the easy answer is simply I don't know, and that was outside of the remit of the project, but would be a really, really interesting point of comparison. I mean, it would also be interesting if I could find ads that were thinking in terms of whānau. So we're thinking in terms of indigenous notions of community and health, but in these ads I couldn't find any. Now, maybe because I don't have anybody on the team who is Māori, and maybe if they read the ads themselves, they would say this doesn't look like it's directed towards a Māori consumership, but there's actually little tells that show us that they are trying to kind of elide things or get around them slightly. But on the whole, the focus tends to be on a model of, I suppose, for want of a better word, Western understandings of the self, the subject as an individual. The difference, I suppose, between that and capitalism specifically is are we not always talking about a context in which we want the consumer to consume as an individual is an interesting one. To my mind, in as much as the history of advertising is the history of patent medicine, I think the history of immunity does much to forward the idea of 20th century understandings of the self as a highly individualized subject. So they kind of feed into one another and bolster one another. But most of the time, we tend to talk about histories of modernity without giving that specific understanding or specific focus on this kind of medico-political discourse that furthers this sense of being alone, purchasing for yourself for the kind of the extremities of your own immune system, as we'd say now. Does that track? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes very good sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking our speaker, Maeve, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Terence. Thank you.